every day it feels like there's another big name being linked to moving to Saudi Arabia. And I know Ronaldo started it last season, but it's snowballing more and more to the point where you ask yourself, what is going on in Saudi Arabia? Myles, you've done a bit of digging into this and some big names being linked, right? So Ruben Neves, half the Chelsea team. It's mad, isn't it? What's your take on it, mate?
My first take is it's a bit harsh to say Ronaldo started it, forgetting West Brom's Mateus Pereira. Come on. Household name he was. Absolute that was legend. A big move. Yeah, no, it's a really interesting situation because we've seen things like this before. We saw the MLS try it to a small degree at one point. We've seen the Chinese Super League obviously come round and start cherry picking some very particular Premier League talent, although it feels like it never quite got to the level that the Saudi League is trying to right now. And there have been players that have been in Saudi Arabia for a year or two now already. I'm thinking of the likes of Ava Banega, and it was clear that they wanted to build a sporting project there. But something doesn't sit right with me about some of it. And it's difficult because as Westerners and fans of European football, you don't want to almost monopolise football to the point where you say that other nations can't have this. That's not the point at all. It would be really nice to see football as a global game expand. But the way in which it's being run currently just feels slightly, I don't know, unsavoury, doesn't it? When you look at the fact that the Saudi investment fund that own Newcastle own 4 of the clubs in Saudi Arabia, who are the 4 biggest spenders right now. That just seems bizarre. Imagine if all of a sudden Sheikh Mansour went and bought Man United, Liverpool and Chelsea as well. It would be such a weird setup, and you'd notice that things didn't quite feel above board there. And then when you also see that not only has he got Newcastle on their books, they're also really heavily involved with Todd Boehly and Chelsea, and now this get out of jail free card for Chelsea and their financial fair play worries has kind of found itself out of nowhere, where now any fringe players that have got massive wages at Chelsea that they're trying to shift and don't really know how to are being linked with Saudi Arabia. It feels like that's a real win-win. The Saudi Pro League gets some big names, Chelsea clears some money off their books. But the people that don't win are the rest of the footballing pyramid in England, for example, or the other Saudi clubs that don't have the same backing. It's a really weird system that doesn't quite feel right at this time.
No, it feels massively unregulated as well. And I know if Premier League clubs decided to do that, there'd be huge sanctions, as you know.
Absolutely.
But the players they're talking about and the fees they're talking about, especially from Chelsea going that way, you've got Kalidou Koulibaly, who's only been there a year. Edouard Mendy, who was, FIFA goalkeeper of the year only like 2 years ago. Who else is there? Remind me. N'Golo Kante as well. Hakim Ziyech. Some massive names. Yeah. And, Ruben Neves has been linked as well at the age of 26. So clearly money is talking in this situation, Dave, isn't it? And it's kind of disconcerting to see as a football fan that much money have that much influence. And I know with the European Super League, we've talked about in the past how it's always like a looming threat that money can skew the playing field slightly. But on this scale, it's a little bit worrying, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's the sad thing, really, is that it's not going for a sporting project, it's not going for a football project. It is mainly all for the money, and that's kind of like the concerning thing for me. Really, is I think the main thing is that these players, what is it? Luka Modric has been offered something like 600 million over the space of 3 years to go from.
Turned it down, supposedly, though. Fair play to him.
Players don't even have to go there for 4 or 5 years. They can literally go for a couple of years or a year even, and they've made probably more in a year there than they would have done 4 or 5 years, obviously in Europe, which is crazy to think. So you can see why they're obviously tempted by the prospect of it, but it doesn't sit right with me that we look at obviously what was happening in China. Obviously you look at likes of Igalo and the players who were going towards the end of their career. But now you have it on the flip side of it. We're having players who are actually kind of in the peak. You've obviously got the likes of Ruben Neves, who was, captain in Porto in the Champions League at the age of 18, 19. He's only 26 now, and he's going, he looks like he's on his way, which is just crazy to think. So I don't know what's going to happen, to be honest.
In Neves' defence, though, have you ever visited Wolverhampton? I might run to Saudi Arabia if I'd lived in Wolverhampton for a few years.
I mean,
mate, this is a guy from Birmingham speaking here. Apologies to anyone from Wolverhampton.
I know. When obviously Ronaldo went, and he said, "Oh, this is going to be one of the top leagues in, a top 5 league really in the world." And I don't think anyone really took him seriously when he said that. But if you look at what it's attracting,
it's a circus, though, isn't it? Because you throw that much money in a short space of time, it's not going to make it that much better. No. I don't know if you caught any of the Saudi Pro League over this last season where Ronaldo's highlights reel is basically him just taking the piss out of them because they're so poor. The goalkeeping's terrible, the defending's terrible, and it didn't take much for a Ronaldo clearly past his prime to boss the league. Yes, they've got.
Didn't win it though.
No, he didn't. No, yeah, that's true. But they've got like a dozen players going over there at least in the next summer window, aren't they? So it will undoubtedly improve the level of teams, Myles. But how long do you think it's going to take if Saudi Arabia want to be taken seriously? Because all that money will will make changes significantly in the next year or so, but not to the level of it being in the same league as like even the French league, I would say.
I don't know, if I'm totally honest. I think the French league's an interesting example because actually there it's a similar setup where money talks, and there's one team. There was two for a while with Monaco that bankroll the league.
Yeah. Bad example.
And then, well, no, it's a good example though because if you're talking about Saudi Arabia trying to get into the top five, that's kind of the level that they're competing with. And you mentioned the standard of defending and goalkeeping, and the fact that sides are looking at players like Koulibaly and Mendy rather than just Ronaldo, Messi, Neymar suggests that maybe it is more of a long-term project in some ways. What will be interesting is to see whether money goes into the infrastructure lower than that, and whether Saudi Arabia start developing a good national team, for example, because yeah, right, they surprised us all at the World Cup a little bit, but if you want a league to be successful, you have to also rely on some of your homegrown players because yeah, right now you can throw a load of money at someone like Ronaldo, but he's not going to be there forever. And then what? What are you left with? You need to have built something long term. It's perfect for the Premier League, if we're totally honest, because for the longest time, the Premier League have inflated the market and made it so if you ever want to comply with financial fair play, you have no choice but to sell your players to players within your league, to clubs within your league, because no one else can afford the wages. Here's a massive, massive caveat to that, where all of a sudden someone is willing to give you that money. And it's interesting because where does that stop? Because you look at China was a really good example. Someone like Oscar that went over there in the prime of his career. Then look at someone like Carrasco who went over there when he wanted to come back. That's difficult all of a sudden. And he had to take a pay cut to do that. So if someone like Neves goes to Saudi Arabia, is there a path for him to ever come back if he inflates his value that much? And that's where it becomes dangerous. I think the Premier League really has to look at the situation with Newcastle and Chelsea and their clear connections, because a lot has come to light over this whole business. The fact that there are such clear links between the Saudi investment funds and Clear Lake Capital suggests that actually what we're criticising Saudi Arabia for having 4 clubs owned by the same people, are we kind of already seeing the same thing on our shores? It's just, I don't know. You see so many people that talk about how much they feel disillusioned by football and they don't really connect with the game since the financial aspects have taken over. And I don't want to sound like one of those people that complained about the formation of the Premier League, but I don't know. You got to wait and see. You've got to wait and see what they do with the game over there and what they invest into making it right. Because right now, no real grassroots, no real women's game. It's a poor setup. We don't need to get into the logistics of the human rights issues that have been discussed widely with Newcastle, for example. You want to see football in its purest form, really, not just a Masters League.
Well, that's the thing. We had the World Cup in Qatar as well, and you're thinking to yourself, what's the legacy from that? Is it just going to be huge stadia that won't ever be filled? So far, I'm not optimistic about the Qatar football aspect either, but Saudi Arabia is clearly a huge pool financially, isn't it?
But there should be a legacy. There should be a legacy. The Middle East should have football and it should be able to celebrate it as its sport, but it should be done organically and properly. It shouldn't be a case of let's buy 2 teams in England essentially and start taking from them and let's put ludicrous amounts of money to attract players in. Maybe that's what it takes. Maybe I'm naive. Maybe they wanted to do it an authentic way and no one's interested in that. But it doesn't feel like they're putting the work in, and that feels kind of like cheating the sport, and that's a shame.